Okay, so we're diving deep today into something you hear everywhere in education these days. Evidence-based practices. Sounds good on the surface, right? Like, who wouldn't want their kids' education to be based on evidence?
Right.
But our guest today, Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, really makes you think twice about what that label actually means.
Yeah, fascinating background, right?
Totally. I mean, a former senior digital forensic scientist working for the city of LA, helping set national standards for forensics.
You know, yeah, not exactly who you picture leading the charge to question evidence.
An author of forensic Photoshop to boot.
Exactly. So this isn't someone who's just like skeptical by nature. Dr. Hoerricks knows what real science looks like, and that's what makes their take on evidence-based education so interesting.
Yeah, it's like they've seen behind the curtain.
Yeah, and what they're saying is that curtain might be hiding a whole lot of stuff that's not actually good science.
So our mission in this deep dive is to figure out, is evidence-based in education truly a mark of scientific rigor? Or is it more like, as Dr. Hoerricks suggests, kind of a misleading slogan?
Big question with huge implications for how we teach kids, how we train teachers, the whole thing.
Right. Okay, so to understand where Dr. Hoerricks is coming from, we got to go back to their forensic science days.
Right.
They talk a lot about this thing called the Dobert standard.
Yeah, the Dover standard, it's basically like this set of rules they use in courtrooms to decide if scientific evidence is actually reliable.
Okay.
Like, can you use it in court, or is it going to get thrown out because it's basically junk science?
I mean, in court, the stakes are so high, right?
Exactly. Someone's freedom is on the line, so you got to have a really high bar for evidence. And Dobert says that evidence has to be three things: reliable, repeatable, and reproducible. Those are like the pillars of good science.
Okay, break those down for me. What does that actually mean?
Sure. So reliable basically means the evidence is consistently accurate. Like it's based on good data, solid methodology, no shaky ground.
Makes sense.
Repeatable means that if you do the same experiment or analysis again,
Yeah.
you should get pretty much the same results. Shows that it wasn't just a fluke the first time.
Right, right.
And then reproducible is like the ultimate test. Can other scientists, completely independent from the original research, take that same method, do their own study, and get the same results?
Oh, okay. So it's not just you getting the same results twice. It's like anyone, anywhere should be able to replicate it.
Exactly. And if they can't, then that raises some serious red flags about the validity of the original findings.
So that's Dobert in a nutshell. And Dr. Hoerricks is saying that a lot of what's labeled evidence-based in education doesn't actually meet those standards.
That's the argument, yeah. Like they saw firsthand how even with something as important as the Dobert standard, there are pressures that can lead to, let's call it, a bending of the rules.
Ooh, interesting.
Think about it, right? You've got huge case backlogs, political agendas sometimes, and suddenly the focus can shift from the science itself to the person doing the analysis. Like, oh, well, they've got all these fancy credentials, so their findings must be solid.
So it becomes about who's saying it, not the strength of the evidence itself.
Yeah, and that's a slippery slope. And Dr. Hoerricks sees the same kind of thing happening in education, like evidence-based becoming more of a marketing term than a guarantee of rigorous science.
So it's being used to sell stuff, basically.
That's a big part of it, yeah. You see these educational programs, interventions, curricula, all branded as evidence-based, but when you actually look at the research behind them, it's often not as solid as you'd think. And often the companies pushing these products are the ones funding the research in the first place.
Ooh, so there's a conflict of interest built right in.
Potentially, yeah. Like, are they really looking for the most effective methods or just the ones that'll sell their product?
Right. So let's dive into the specifics. When we talk about evidence-based education not living up to the Dobert standard, what are the main problems?
Okay, let's take reliability first.
Okay.
One of the big issues is that a lot of educational research is done in very specific settings,
Okay.
which are often not very representative of the real world. Like, a study might be done in a private school
Right.
with a very homogeneous student population, but then those findings get applied to public schools with kids from all different backgrounds, learning styles, needs.
Right, right.
So the method might work great in that very controlled research environment, but is it really reliable when you try to apply it broadly?
And that's a problem because teachers are often expected to just implement these evidence-based practices as if there's some kind of magic bullet.
Right. And then when it doesn't work as advertised,
Uh-huh.
guess who gets blamed? The teacher. Not the method itself.
It's always the teacher's fault. Right.
And that brings us to repeatability, or maybe the lack of it. Dr. Hoerricks talks about this idea of fidelity of implementation,
Okay.
which is basically the idea that if you don't implement a method perfectly, then any failure is on you, the teacher,
Right.
not on the method itself. But Dr. Hoerricks says, wait a minute, in real science, a good method should be robust enough to work even with some variation in implementation.
Like you shouldn't have to be a robot to get it right.
Exactly. If it's so fragile that only one very specific way of doing it will work,
Yeah.
then maybe the problem is with the method, not the teacher.
Right. Makes you think about all those professional development workshops where they're like, do it exactly like this.
Right. And it's like, have you met a classroom full of kids? Nothing ever goes exactly like you planned.
Never. Okay, so we've got reliability and repeatability. What about reproducibility?
So this is a big one, like the cornerstone of good science.
Okay.
If you can't reproduce findings, it throws the whole thing into question.
Right.
Reproducibility means independent researchers with no ties to the original study should be able to take that method, do their own study, and get similar results. If they can't, then it's a huge red flag.
Correct.
And Dr. Hoerricks is saying that a lot of educational research just doesn't get independently replicated. Like, it gets published, maybe gets cited a bunch of times, but no one's actually trying to reproduce it to see if it holds up.
So we're taking these findings at face value, basically.
Yeah, and that's risky, especially when you think about how these evidence-based practices are often used to make decisions about how kids are taught, what interventions they get, all sorts of things.
It's like we're building this whole system on potentially shaky ground.
That's the concern, and it's not just a theoretical concern either. Dr. Hoerricks points to some very specific examples.
Okay, what's your...
One that comes up a lot is interventions for autism. You know, ABA, applied behavior analysis.
Right, that's considered the gold standard, right?
Yeah, you hear evidence-based all the time when people talk about ABA, but Dr. Hoerricks points out that a lot of the research behind it has some serious limitations.
Like what?
Well, a lot of the studies have small sample sizes, which makes it hard to generalize the findings to the wider population. And sometimes there are issues with conflicts of interest, like the researchers might be getting funding from companies that provide ABA therapy.
So there's that financial incentive again.
Right. And then there's the question of long-term outcomes. Like, a lot of the research focuses on short-term gains.
Okay.
But what happens 5 years down the line, 10 years? We don't always have good data on that.
So it's kind of a buyer beware situation, even with something as widely accepted as ABA.
That's what Dr. Hoerricks is suggesting, yeah. And they make a similar point about the science of reading.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one these days. Lots of debate about that.
And rightly so. Dr. Hoerricks acknowledges that there's solid research on phonics, on the importance of explicit instruction in those foundational literacy skills. But the problem is that research has been kind of hijacked.
Well, hijacked. By whom?
Well, by companies selling very specific curricula and assessments that claim to be based on the science of reading. But a lot of those programs haven't actually been independently tested.
So we don't know if they actually work better than other approaches.
Right. And Dr. Hoerricks worries that this push for a very specific scripted approach can actually end up harming kids who learn differently, like kids with dyslexia or multilingual learners. The research base just isn't there yet to say that this one-size-fits-all approach is the best for everyone.
Okay, so it's not that the underlying science is bad.
Right.
It's that it's being used to justify things that haven't actually been proven effective.
And that's where the evidence-based label becomes really dangerous because it creates this illusion of certainty when the reality is much more complex.
So this all sounds pretty worrying. Like, what are the real-world consequences of all this?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks makes this really powerful comparison to the legal system.
Okay.
They talk about how in court, if you use bad science, the worst case scenario is that an innocent person ends up in jail.
That's terrifying.
Absolutely. And Dr. Hoerricks argues that while the stakes might not seem as high in education, the consequences can still be really significant, like kids getting stuck in interventions that aren't right for them, falling further behind, teachers getting blamed for things that are actually the fault of the method itself.
Right. And they even get this example from ProPublica about an FBI forensic scientist whose testimony was totally flawed.
Right. And it led to all these wrongful convictions, like just devastating consequences.
It's scary to think that something similar could be happening in education.
And it's not just about the immediate harm to individual kids or teachers. It's also about the erosion of trust. Like, if
Uh,
we keep throwing around this evidence-based label without actually holding things to a high scientific standard,
right.
then people are going to start to question the whole system.
Yeah, like why should I believe anything you say?
Exactly. So what's the solution? Well, Dr. Hoerricks has a pretty clear call to action.
Yeah, what is it?
They say educators need to stop taking evidence-based claims at face value
Okay.
and start asking some tough
Like
questions.
what?
Like, who funded this research? Was it peer-reviewed? What were the limitations of the study? Are there any conflicts of interest? Has it been replicated by other researchers? Is the sample size big enough and diverse enough to be meaningful?
It's like don't just blindly accept what you're told. Do your own due diligence.
Exactly. And Dr. Hoerricks says if you can't get clear answers to those questions,
Yeah,
then be skeptical. Don't just implement something because it has the evidence-based label slapped on it.
push back a little.
Yeah, push back. And ultimately, Dr. Hoerricks' message is this. If a method can't be reliably, repeatably, and reproducibly shown to be effective, then it's not science, and it doesn't belong in our classrooms.
Powerful stuff. So to sum up, it sounds like the takeaway here isn't to reject research altogether.
Right.
It's to demand better research.
Exactly. We need to hold educational research to the same high standards as any other scientific field.
And maybe we need to be a little more skeptical of anyone who tries to sell us something based on the evidence-based label alone.
It's a good rule of thumb in general, I think. Don't just take things at face value. Dig a little deeper, ask those tough questions.
Yeah, because ultimately what's at stake here is our kids' education. And that's not something we can afford to get wrong. So as Dr. Hoerricks would say, push back, ask for proof, and don't settle for anything less than rigorous science.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for having me on this deep dive.
Of course, always a pleasure. And for our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What are your experiences with evidence-based practices? Have you encountered any that seemed, well, less than scientific? Let us know in the comments and keep those critical thinking caps on.
That's right. Always stay curious.
Until next time, happy deep diving.
See ya!